Does he possess her or does she possess him? That's the exact question that sparked one of the greatest literary mysteries of our time. Picture this for a second. It's the late 20th century, and a brilliant author is just sitting there in the old, round reading room of the British Museum. She's watching this renowned living scholar pace endlessly around the catalog, literally dedicating her entire existence to studying a dead poet. It's an obsession, a haunting, and really, it forms the very core of what we are unpacking today.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a really close look at A.S. Byatt's 1990 Booker Prize-winning masterpiece, Possession, a Romance. Now, I've got to tell you, this isn't just your standard love story. It's this incredibly brilliant blend of historical fiction and an academic detective mystery, and it dives deep into what it truly means to be completely consumed by the past, by art, and by another person. We're going to sift through the fascinating sources and the scholarship surrounding this text to really uncover the hidden depths of its characters and its metaphors. Okay, let's dive into this roadmap. We'll be covering 1. The real-world genesis. 2. A literary detective story. 3. Parallels in the characters. 4. Passion versus intellect. And finally, 5. Decoding the fairy tales.
Starting right off with Section 1, the genesis of a masterpiece.
So Byatt didn't just write this novel out of nowhere. It was actually a direct response to authors like John Fowles, and she wanted to explore the real economic and romantic realities of possession. And to pull this off, she used a technique known as historiographic metafiction. Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful, right? But basically, it's a postmodern genre that mashes up historical fiction with metafiction. Byatt is essentially writing a story about people who are trying to piece together a story. She's forcing us to look at how history is constructed by the texts that happen to survive, and, maybe more importantly, by the texts that are deliberately kept hidden. And speaking of texts, this is wild. Byatt actually had to invent all the poetry and the letters of her fictional Victorian lovers, Randolph Henry Ashe and Christabel Lamont. At first, she pitched using existing historical poetry to her editor, but he just flat out told her, "Nonsense, you will write them yourself." So she sat down and wrote over 1,700 lines of original Victorian-style verse. Crazy, right? But not everyone was a fan at first. Actually, an early American publisher practically begged her to cut the poetry, telling her, "You have ruined a nice intrigue with these excrescences." Thankfully, she ignored them and kept the poems in, weaving the novel into this continuous, brilliant thread.
Moving on to Section 2, a literary detective story.
Byatt was heavily inspired by Umberto Eco to construct this mystery backwards, sending our modern scholars on an illicit, high-stakes quest. If you look at this timeline, it all kicks off in the London Library. This obscure scholar, Roland Meachell, stumbles upon handwritten drafts of a letter by the eminent Victorian poet Ashe. And what does he do? Roland commits the absolute ultimate academic sin. He steals them. This kicks off a frantic paper trail with a feminist scholar named Maud Bailey. Together, they trace Ashe and Lamott's deeply secret affair all the way across the Channel to Brittany, where they discover a hidden illegitimate daughter. And the whole thing culminates in this dramatic Gothic climax during the Great Storm of 1987, where these rival academics literally exhume Ashe's grave.
That brings us to Section 3, Parallels in the Characters.
As our modern scholars are digging furiously into the past, their own lives start to eerily mirror the historical figures they're studying. But before we get to the main lovers, we've got to talk about the supporting casts, who are all part of what's humorously called the academic Ashe factory. You've got James Blackadder, who's Roland's exhausted employer, Beatrice Nest, who ferociously guards the diaries of Ashe's wife, Mortimer Cropper, this flashy American collector who just views history as physical artifacts to be bought, and Leonora Stern, an American scholar focused completely on Lamott's work. Every single one of them represents a totally different academic motive, and they are competing so fiercely in this race to uncover the truth, mostly just to boost their own reputations. And this brilliantly illustrates the central mirroring of the entire text. On one side, you have the Victorian lovers, Randolph Ashe and Christabel Lamont. Their affair is wildly passionate, short-lived, incredibly tragic, and of course, strictly constrained by 19th century society. But then, on the other side, we have our modern scholars, Roland Meachell and Maud Bailey. Now, despite living in the supposedly liberated 1980s, these two are emotionally frozen. They're overly analytical, and quite frankly, they are terrified of romance. It's such a great contrast. The Victorians had to hide their passion from the world, but the moderns, they hide their passion from themselves. Let's look closer at that in Section 4, Passion versus Intelligence. To really understand these guarded modern characters, we can draw on some fantastic scholarship by Susan Cueta, who points out that this whole tension actually comes straight out of A.S. Byatt's own life. Back in the 1950s, Byatt went through this profound personal struggle, trying to reconcile her identity as a woman with her massive intellectual aspirations. She actually admitted that keeping her identity as a passionate woman, totally separate from her identity as an intellectual, was just a necessary strategy for survival. It was honestly just too difficult for a woman at that time to be fully recognized and respected as both. And this exact dichotomy is literally the heartbeat of the novel. We see passion, which is defined here as love, sexuality, and motherhood, placed in direct, harsh opposition to intellect, which is independence, privacy, and artistry. Byatt is using her fictional characters to issue a really stark warning here. She's warning against a singularity that would force any woman to completely deny her passion just to embrace her intellect, or vice versa. The ideal, she argues, is the integration of the two. I mean, think about it. How often do we still feel pressured, even today, to hide our personal passions just to be taken seriously in our professional lives? This flows perfectly into Section 5, Decoding the Fairy Tales. Because you see, Byatt doesn't just flat out state her themes, she hides them beautifully inside classic myths. Take the Brothers Grimm tale Rapunzel, for example. In the traditional story, Rapunzel is locked away right at puberty, and she's known almost entirely for that beautiful, long golden hair. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that in literary analysis, her hair acts as this powerful physical metaphor for female sexuality and physical beauty. It is literally the only thing the prince values about her initially. Byatt maps the symbolism directly onto Maud Bailey. Maud is a gorgeous blonde, but she aggressively hides her hair. I mean, when we first meet Maud, her hair is wound so tightly inside this green peacock feather turban, even while she's just sitting indoors. And why? Because as a prominent feminist scholar, she was actually once hissed at during an academic conference by peers who just assumed her blonde hair was dyed to make her look like a marketable, seductive product. It's awful. Maud is terrified of being treated like Rapunzel. She doesn't want to be judged solely by her appearance, her passion, or her sexuality at the expense of her towering intellect. Which makes the moments where Maud finally lets her guard down just incredibly potent. There's this scene in Whitby Harbor where Maud takes off her scarf to show an old woman a brooch. And the text notes that, with her pale hair suddenly exposed, she looked almost shockingly naked. It's a huge moment. It emphasizes just how strictly she adheres to keeping her physical beauty hidden away, entirely terrified of that simplistic fairy tale appraisal of her worth. But as Roland and Maud's investigation gets deeper, so does their trust in one another. There's a beautiful, really pivotal scene where Roland gently asks her why she always covers her head. Maud finally opens up and explains her fears, and then, very slowly, she begins to unweave her long, thick braids for him. She shakes her head, just letting the air into her constricted hair. And it's not just a romantic moment, though it is that. It's Maud finally integrating her passionate, physical self with her intellectual self in a space where she feels safe.
Now, Byatt also weaves in Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid. And we're talking about the original here. Think about the terrifyingly high stakes and the core tragedy of this tale. The mermaid goes to the sea witch and irreversibly trades away her tongue just to get a pair of human legs to pursue the prince. In Byatt's hands, the loss of the mermaid's tongue perfectly represents the loss of female intellect and voice. The mermaid can't communicate her mind anymore. She has to rely entirely on her physical body to win love. And this mermaid motif pops up everywhere in the novel. Ash's wife, Ellen, is described early on as a presiding mermaid perched on a rock. And that brooch Maud was wearing in Whitby Harbor, yep, it's a family heirloom depicting a mermaid. Byatt is using this myth to represent the very painful sacrifices women have historically made, essentially silencing their own minds in order to be loved. So the crucial point is how absolutely all of this comes together down in the grave. During that wild climax in The Great Storm, the academics dig up a box buried with ash, and inside they find a lock of blonde hair. For the entire second half of the book, both the characters and us, the readers, just assume this hair belongs to his lover, Christabel Lamont. But the epilogue reveals a crushing, absolutely beautiful truth. Ash actually had a brief chance encounter with his illegitimate daughter, Maya, just before he died. That lock of hair belonged to his child, not his lover. The modern scholars had completely and utterly misunderstood the artifact, which finally brings us to the true meaning of possession. It is the physical ownership of historical artifacts. It is the haunting of the living by the dead. It is the sexual and romantic possession of another human being. And, maybe most importantly, it is the perilous, obsessive nature of biographical study itself. It's about the pure arrogance of thinking we can ever fully know or possess the truth of someone else's life based solely on the paper trail they happened to leave behind.
As Maud and Roland learn the hard way, history isn't just some puzzle waiting to be solved. It is a living, breathing force that fundamentally changes the people who touch it. I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to ponder today. As we study history, as we read old letters, and as we uncover long-lost secrets, do we possess the past, or does the past possess us? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the stories you're told.